what is this? That's right, it's a box from Get FPV, and you know what that means? That means we're going to be building my dream quad. So stick around if you want to watch, but if you don't, leave, because I don't really care. I do this for fun anyways. Oh, that sounded harsh, didn't it? Okay, let's get into it. So, to tell you the truth, this box isn't completely from Get FPV. Most of these components are from Get FPV, but a few I got from Race Day Quads because they had better prices. And a few I just made. So, for instance, this is a TPU printed GoPro mount for the TBS Source 1. Yeah, I just 3D printed that. So let's get into the build. Here we have the TBS Source 1 quadcopter frame. So I got this quadcopter frame for a few reasons. One, the arms, as I'll show you here. See these? These are very rounded corners, which in my opinion, and in science's opinion, will distribute the forces of a crash much better than an edge. That being said, some quadcopter frames have like spikes on the end or very sharp edges. That just means that if it's in a crash, those edges are going to be gone because the force of that impact will just destroy them. And also, this is a lot of space between the motors that I'll be putting on it and the edge, which means that my bell caps will be protected in a crash. Also, I'm going to be using the JB 4-in-1 ESC, which means that I don't need to put my ESCs on this carbon fiber frame, which means the arms can be smaller. So this makes up in weight, but this decreases the weight. So I figured it'd be kind of even. Also, I'm coming from an Armatan Chameleon, which is an extremely heavy quadcopter. Next, we have the J. Bardwell 32-bit 4-in-1 ESCs, as I mentioned previous, and the all-in-one flight controller. I figured these would be a good pair together. Alright, here we go. This is some exciting news right here. This is the Hypetrain Acro 450 kV motors. Super excited to try these out. From what I've read, they're amazing. I've never used them before, but they're not a cheap... Ooh, that feels good. Ooh, that feels good. They're not a cheap motor, and I just love the look of them, and I've heard they're pretty much a go-to. Plus, it has Rotor Riot on it. Who doesn't like Rotor Riot? I have to like Rotor Riot. I love Rotor Riot. I wish I was a part of Rotor Riot. Rotor Riot, hire me. Okay, moving on. Next, we have the Runcam Eagle 2 Pro. This is a top-of-the-line camera that I cannot wait to try. I've run the Runcam Eagle 2 for a long time, but the Eagle 2 Pro is even a step better than that. The only difference is that this doesn't do low light as well, but it does have better resolution. So I can't wait to try that out. Alright, let's start building the frame. Last of all, we have the Frsky R9 Mini. That's right, I'll be using a long-range setup for this quad. As you can see here, I also have the R9M receiver on the back of my Taranis X9D. I can't wait to give this a try. Alright, let's start building this frame. One other reason why I'm using the TBS Source 1 is that everything is open source and the frame itself is super cheap. Last I checked, it was going for $26. That's an amazing price. For instance, I'm using another go-to quadcopter frame, the Armatan Chameleon, and that's $100. So I'm just going to speed through this assembly video because at this point I'm pretty sure everyone knows how to put these things together. It's pretty easy to just assemble these, and it also comes with little diagrams, so it's pretty easy to see what to do. Nonetheless, I'll still put a time lapse, so enjoy. One thing I'd like to mention before we get into the rest of this, the bag comes with screws that are not organized. So one thing I always do before I do a frame build is organize my screws in the right size. So it looks to me like these are 10 millimeter screws, and these are, looks like 14, and nice hex bits. So I like to organize these. It seems like those are the only two sizes, which is really nice. For something like the Chameleon, I know from experience that there's like 3 or 4 different lengths of screws, and you know, some of them require different hex bits than others. It looks like these are all the M3 version, so I believe. So all you need is, you know, I use like a 5x64 inch, which maybe is why my screws get stuck. It's really good to have metric. This is not metric, but it does the job most times. One thing I have also noticed, they did not include any Allen wrenches, so you need to have some on hand if you're going to complete this frame. Alright, let's get back to it. So it looks to me like this is a perfect place for my receiver, so I'm going to do that now. I'm going to place that. Wow, my God, that's small. Alright, so now I think we should begin soldering. Here is the iron I will be using, the TS100. I 3D printed a case for it. You can see in my previous video about this. You can get this case on my eBay store if you so desire. Alright, I'm going to hook this up to a LiPo battery and start soldering my receiver. One thing that I've learned in the past is that if you put your flight controller down or your ESCs down before you solder your receiver pads, then, well, you got a bit of an issue because now you can't access those receiver pads down there. So I'm going to solder up all these and just put some amount of wire, it really doesn't matter, out, so that when I put it on I can then trim exactly how much I need. Now, with the way I have my receiver set up, with the bind key on the underside of the quad, this image that they give you here is flipped. So my S-bus out, which should be on this side according to the image given, is now this side. So be sure that you have your receiver in the right orientation. If you flip it, it's no big deal. You just have to remember that the diagram is not going to be completely correct. So next is going to be the S port, and luckily I'm using the Joshua Bardwell flight controller, which means that I have a telemetry pad. Sometimes F4 flight controllers don't have that. For the telemetry, I'll be using this blue wire. That is just beautiful. Beautiful. This is why I love this soldering iron. The tip is so fine. It's wonderful. One thing to note, since I'm using a LiPo battery for this, it's good to check the voltage, because LiPo batteries do not like going too low on voltage. So I'm going to take my battery checker here, plug this in. So I'm still at 50% battery, which means that I can continue to use this. One thing that I've noticed with the TS100 is that, I mean, it really doesn't suck the battery out of these LiPos. You can pretty much solder, you know, a whole quadcopter on one LiPo battery with this TS100. It's really nice. Now it's going to heat up, and it heats up fast. I usually go about 350 or so. Always make sure your tip is clean. It does oxidize occasionally. Next we have the ground. It's important not to touch these little boards for too long, because otherwise you'll overheat them, and you might destroy some leads. After that, we have the voltage in. Okay, just like that. And that's all there is to it. I do have an inverted S port, but we don't need that. One thing I am going to change, these are just, in my opinion, not long enough. So I'm probably going to take them out and switch them for probably some of these. These are 16 millimeters. And the reason for doing that is because I want to be able to, prop up my all-in-one ESC and then put these and then still be able to put my flight controller on. And right now there's just not enough room for all that with just this little stick out right here. I'm going to switch these out and put in the longer screws. Okay, so now that I've finally figured out how I want to mount this, now it's time to start tinning the pads and putting on the motors. So this I designed for the Armatan Chameleon. It's a soft motor mount, but it seems to fit decently well for the TBS Source 1. So I'm just gonna put all my motors on this. Alright, here's a time lapse of this. Alright, it's now time to hook up the battery. Now unfortunately, with this 4-in-1 ESC, I have to do something a little different. According to the manual, I need to solder 24 gauge wire from the ESC to my flight controller, and also to the bridge. So right here, I need to solder that part right there. So this is the current sensor right here. I need to put my 12 gauge wire on the load side of the current sensor and connect it to my positive on the ESC. The thing that I'm noticing is 400 degrees Celsius is just not enough to really let the solder flow. I don't know if you can see this. It's kind of globby and doesn't flow very nicely, So I might have to switch over to my Weller soldering iron over here for the bigger stuff. So I think that's what I'm going to do. Give my LiPo battery a break. Yeah, you're able to solder battery leads with a TS100, but in my opinion, it's just not powerful enough to really get the job done. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over. It's still great for field work though. It's still amazing for field work. Typically you're not having to build a quad in the field. So I still think it's an amazing iron. Okay, so here's what I've done so far. So as you can see through here, I've soldered all my receiver wires onto the flight controller. And behind that, it's very hard to tell with this flight controller. Everything is so compact. But we have the camera wires also, which are these. Now, I have these two wires. This is the audio wire and the VBAT wire. I do not use those. I will not use these. I may in the future, which is why I put shrink wrap over it and off to the side. So it's not the best situation, but everything is safe. As long as I'm just gonna twist this up and keep it off to the side, and it won't touch anything because I have those ends on it. So also I'm putting a 35 volt 100 microfarad capacitor onto my battery leads in order to reduce noise. I really don't I don't think there'll be any noise with my setup. But in the rare case that there is, I really want to filter out all that noise before I even start flying it. So I'm just, as a preemptive measure, I'm going to put this capacitor back here. I know for one thing, on my Chameleon, I could not use the capacitor at all because the plates were so close together that this capacitor would not fit. But in this setup, I think the capacitor will fit nicely. So I'm going to put that on and I'll get back with you. Alright, now the quad is completed. Everything has been soldered together. Next, all that's left to do is configure everything in Betaflight. Since I'm using the JB flight controller, we use Betaflight. If you have another flight controller in Betaflight, these settings can be similar. Maybe not exact, but in general, this is probably going to be a good setup for any F4 as a basis. If you just want to copy everything down, you can do that. I won't guarantee with your flight controller that it'll be perfect. It'll probably still need some tweaking, but that's up to the individual pilot depending on what they like. So now I'm going to connect my quadcopter. Okay, and as you can see here, I have my accelerometer turned on. I already have completed this quadcopter in Betaflight, but I'm just going to run by step what means what. First off, I always go to this setup page. I make sure my quad is on a flat surface and I calibrate the accelerometer right here. Now you see it should be flat, and I can roll everything, and it looks like everything is in the right direction. So as you can see here, I'm pitching forward, the quad is pitching forward. Point is, I want to make sure it lines up. If it doesn't line up, we're going to have to go into this configuration tab and change the direction of the flight controller. Because I mounted my flight controller with the front facing the front, everything lines up perfectly without me having to tweak anything. However, if you mount your flight controller sideways, you're going to have to go to the configuration tab and roll down to board and sensor alignment and start changing this. If you, for instance, change it where you mount the board for some reason backwards, where front is back and back is front, then you're going to have to put 180 degrees in the yaw direction. Alright, so let's go back to the port setup. I'm just going to go down the list. So right off the bat, you see that this USB VCP is activated with a baud rate of 115,200. That should always stay the same. Do not ever change that. If you change it and hit save and reboot, there's a likely chance that you won't ever be able to connect to your flight controller. So always keep that activated. Next, I soldered my receiver onto UART1. Normally, on your flight controller, it will say RX1, TX1, and those pads will be close together. In that case, that means that this is UART1. If you go on to Joshua Bardwell's manual, he clearly states everything, and make sure you get a flight controller that you understand where the UARTs are. Next, on UART3, I have my Spark port telemetry output. And finally, I have one peripheral being used. These are your peripherals tab, and that's my TBS Smart Audio. That is for the VTX. The VTX I'm using is the Mach 3. If you're using the exact same setup that I am, this is what you should be activating. However, if you don't have the same flight controller and you didn't solder the same place as I did, you may just have to rearrange UART1, UART3, UART2, and all these peripherals and telemetry. Next, let's go into the configuration tab. And since I'm using the 4-in-1 ESCs from Joshua Bardwell, I can run DShot 1200. So far, I've had very good luck with this. I've already flown my quad. I've gone to Nashville, Tennessee, and Georgia. I'll show you a short clip. It's very nice. I'm running 8K, gyro update frequency and my PID loop frequency, and I have my accelerometer activated. Now, just because I have my accelerometer activated does not mean that I'm in stabilized mode. So if I let go of the sticks, I'm still in freestyle mode. If I let go of the sticks, they're going to hold that position, and unless I counteract it with a different stick movement, it's going to fall out of the air. Next, this is something I always like to do. I like to set my maximum arm angle to 180 degrees. That essentially disarms this arming warning system. So essentially, if I have my quad on an unlevel surface, it will allow me to take off even though I'm not perfectly flat. If you're using Spectrum or Frsky, you want to use the serial-based receiver. Most people nowadays are using a serial-based receiver. If you're not, you should probably get on board. And if you're using an Frsky receiver like I am, I'm using the R9 Mini, you click S-Bus. If you're using Spectrum, you would click Spectrum. Next, I have my telemetry feature activated, as well as air mode, OSD, and anti-gravity. Air mode, I love having it on all the time. Since I do a lot of proximity and since I do a lot of inversions, I like to maintain low throttle authority, and that's what air mode helps do. Also, since as a FPV pilot, I do a lot of punch outs with my throttle. Anti-gravity helps diminish that sort of a shake, so it boosts the I term with drastic throttle changes, and that prevents you from getting like a vibration or a jitter. Next, we'll just go straight to failsafe. On my transmitter, the X9D, I have my failsafe already set, and I set it through the receiver. So I set that to no pulses, but you can also do the same thing here. I always recommend clicking this because even though you may press the land feature, it doesn't know where the ground is, so even if you land flat, it'll still be spinning and you might cause a lot of damage. So if I were you, I'd just click drop. Alright, now the nitty-gritty, what everybody wants. Here's my PIDs. If you want to copy this, you can. This is pretty much straight from what Ledrib recommended in one of his Rotor Riot videos. I do fly it a little bit differently. I enjoy more of a super rate than he does. If you don't have the same quad setup, like I said, you might have to change a few values. Also, I got rid of my throttle expo, but some people like it. I've done both, and I do occasionally like 0.5 throttle expo, so that way I have a better time of hovering. I have I-term rotation set and VBAT PID compensation set, as well as I-term relax. You can read about all these here. Next, I set up my receiver. In my controller, I have my channel mapping from channel 1 to channel 4 set as throttle, ailerons, elevators, and rudder, which essentially translates to throttle, roll, pitch, and yaw. I have channel smoothing set, and my RC interpolation is set to auto. I've trimmed all my motor values so that the center point is at 1500, and if my receiver were on, you would see that the throttle is set to 1000 in its low point and 2000 at its high point. There are plenty of videos out there on how to set this up. You have to use your transmitter to do that. Next, in the modes tab, I have my arm set to a certain switch, my angle mode set to a certain switch, so that way if I want to go into stabilized mode really quickly, I can just flip the switch and my quad levels out. I also have a beeper set up. Those are ESC beepers, and turtle mode and pit mode. Okay, so in order to calibrate your ESCs, all you have to do is plug in your flight controller, make sure it's plugged in, but do not plug in your LiPo. Hit I understand the risks, and make sure your propellers are removed, and raise this master slider all the way up to full power. Obviously, the LiPo isn't on, so your propellers will not spin. But in order to calibrate them, now plug in your LiPo battery, and after your LiPo is plugged in, they still should not be spinning, and then you're going to want to lower the master slider all the way to the bottom. And then if you raise it again, all of your motors should start up at the same time and your ESCs will be calibrated. Last but not least, you can go into your Osd settings and move around what settings you want. I like to have my milliamp usage displayed, my current draw displayed, as well as the main battery voltage, as well as the warnings and my name. You can obviously do whatever you want for that. So basically that's all there is to it. Your quad is ready to fly. This is my setup. I love it. Feel free to copy it. Feel free to ask questions. And I will see you in the next video.